So imagine for a second that someone offers to pay you $10 for every book that you read, and there's no qualifications except that it has to be published and you read it from cover to cover. So think about what type of books you would read. Okay, now how many of you are thinking of William Shakespeare? Or Hemingway? Dickens? No, you're not, because it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't. Like, you're not going to optimize the amount of money you're going to get, and you're probably going to read picture books. Lots of Dr. Seuss maybe, but you're not going to be reading those better books. And this was the same strategy chosen by over 100 children across schools in all of the United States by Dr. Alfie Kohn, a professor at Harvard University in the psychology department. And it seems like it makes sense, it really does. You want to keep up with your competitors, other students who are reading those shorter books, you want to make money, you want to make it happen. But what happens if this is the only thing that gets you to read? What happens if this is applied to the workplace? Because eventually you're going to transition from school to the workplace. And what happens when the money stops flowing? Well, these were all questions that he asked in his book, Punished by Rewards. And he came to a conclusion that incentive learning inherently has a bias to be misconstrued and warped. And it's flawed in its execution. And I argue that if we really want to use incentives correctly, we need a shift in our philosophy in how we behave with them and how we couple our motivations behind them. So my purpose today is to prove that to you. So I'm going to do this by going over 3 quick points. The problems, why those problems are actually problems despite what it may seem like, and the solutions that already exist and are being implemented and are extremely successful. So let's go over the problems. Well, incentive learning reduces the amount of internal motivation because it makes us dependent on external incentives. It makes us dependent on something outside of ourselves. And once that something is gone, we no longer feel the motivation. So recall our example of the children when they're reading the books. This experiment did happen, as I said, and once they took away the incentive, all of the children stopped reading. Across the board, even the children who had been reading previously, they stopped because they no longer had. They created a dependency, an artificial dependency. And that's significant because really most of our learning happens outside of the classroom, outside of the workplace, and so outside the realm of incentives. So many of us learn how we behave every day and how we make choices outside of the realm of incentives. And so when we remove our motivation to do things without incentives, we put ourselves at a serious disadvantage. So there were 3 significant conclusions that Dr. Kohn came to as a result of these children making those choices. Now, the first was that those who didn't read started to read. They were working much harder than they previously had. The second was that the children who had been working hard previously lowered their standard and started working not as hard. And the last was that once it stopped, nobody was reading. And those are significant because they paint a picture for us of what incentives do when they're not applied correctly to a system. So, for instance, in the first one, those who don't read start to read. It gives you an artificial sense of success. The general ratings go up, and everyone's happy about it. But that comes at a cost, and we see that by the children who are not working as hard. And this also extends to the workplace of people who are not working as hard as they were before because they can't compete with the other people who are doing things that optimize their behavior. The second part of, and then the final part, which is extremely important, when the incentive stops, it ends all the motivation. The artificial motivation you got from putting incentives there in the first place is gone, obviously, because the incentive is no longer there. There's no motivation to use that incentive. It's gone. But so is the natural incentive, the incentive that was already there before you were there. And you have a net loss. But there's an issue with this, and this is one of the major causes. A loss of incentive, it's very hard to see. And there's a reason for that. Teachers and managers often are not with their workers or students very long. So for instance, a teacher maybe a semester, maybe a year, a manager maybe 3 or 4 years according to the US Census Bureau. Management changes that fast. And so they're only observing their constituents when the incentives are being applied. But as soon as those incentives are gone, what do? They stop working at them. So I'm going to ask you a question, ask you to think a little bit. How many of you look back at classes that you worked in that are no longer technically relevant to what you're learning to familiarize yourself with that material? How many of you look back at material from classes that you don't take anymore? Yeah, none of us, according to the survey that we took. And there's a reason for that. According to Amron Beardsley at Harvard, again in the psychology department, in a peer-reviewed journal, Incentives with No Impact, we don't look at it because there's no incentive. And I know, we can't all fall in love with calculus, it's obvious, but it's shocking that we're willing to spend so much damn time learning things just to forget them. Just because there's no incentive. And that's, for me, the primary cause of why incentives are so difficult. They create irrelevance. They make things irrelevant. You don't need to know this because it's not going to help you get somewhere. It creates it. And this can be observed in an example from General Mills, posted on their actual website, because of transparency reasons. A couple years back, they had issues going on with insect parts being put into frozen vegetables. It's natural, it happens, because working in the fields, it happens and it's an issue. But they were having higher rates than they wanted. So they told workers, hey, if you find insect parts, we'll give you a bonus. They spent the next 3 months